let's go on to the agenda slide. But this is the third in a series of webcasts that we've been doing on the audio-video system. And the first one was about jump-starting and how the basics of the Sametime audio-video system works. The second one was then on how to extend that out into high availability and how to start planning the environment. And this one is meant to follow through on that after you've got it built and how to troubleshoot it, because while we like to think that audio-video deployments go smoothly, we all know that there's a lot of moving parts in it, and sometimes the hardest thing to do is to figure out where the trouble point is and how to figure out how to solve it. So this presentation today is really, as much as it is to help you troubleshoot, it's really also to help us help you, which means that we're going to, by the end of today, hopefully show you not only how to set up troubleshooting and where to locate necessary trace files and log files, and how to some of the basic scenarios of audio-video problems that we see in the field, but is to help you get that information together so that when you open a PMR or when you send one of us an email asking questions about how to do something, you've already got the information in front of you to help speed up the resolution of the problem. So obviously today we're going to spend, is that any better? Is the volume better, folks? I've got a couple of pings about the audio being low.
Operator, could we raise the audio for Tony? I'm hearing it fine, but I guess others are having trouble.
Sure, ma'am. I just raised the audio.
Okay. Is that better, Roberto and Giorgio? Okay. Well, I'll assume they're hearing me. But so today we're going to go through both the client side, the rich client troubleshooting, and the web player troubleshooting. Thanks, guys. And then, of course, we're going to walk into the server side, which is WebSphere diagnostics. We're going to talk a bit about the right trace in the right place, which is, you know, a common issue when we're troubleshooting a complex system here. And then we're going to work through, hopefully throughout the presentation, I'll talk through with some different scenarios as I'm going through the slides themselves, but at the end of the presentation I've got several slides that have some more specific scenarios and what you would gather to help us troubleshoot it. The other key point about today's presentation is that while a lot of the specifics are tied to the audio-video components. In other words, some of the trace settings I'll show you are specific to audio-video. The concepts and things work just as well for if you're troubleshooting other Sametime components, or when we get to the server side and we're talking about WebSphere diagnostics. The techniques and things I'm going to show you today work for all of our components and even for other WebSphere-based products. Just the difference will be in the trace strings you would provide to the system. So with that in mind, Tracy, let's go. Yep. For the UIM client, I'm just going to start off with the very obvious links here to our info center. I say obvious because I'm used to finding them, but sometimes when you haven't been into that system and you haven't made your bookmarks yet, they're kind of difficult to find where to get started. But but along with the links here, the note is very important. I'm not telling you things that aren't out there in public information now. Yes, I've got, through the years of experience and the working with multiple customers, I've got a lot more experience in how to troubleshoot it, but the details of this information is already in our info center, and I'm going to refer to it quite often just to help give you those little shortcuts into the system to help you find the information. So here we've got the two links, one for troubleshooting the clients and what logging and tracing to set. And on the next slide, one of the things you'll find through that information is the client workspace for standalone clients. And the reason I bring this up is because this is where, if you need to set the tracing, this is where your customization.ini file will be set. This is where your logs will come from. And these things, and probably one of the hardest things to help customers when they first send us in a request for help is set your tracing. We'll say set the tracing, and we'll say, well, where do I set it? Well, this is the paths that you will find the information in. And on the next slide, that's for the standalone client. The next slide is for the embedded clients, because once you embed Sametime within Notes, those paths change. So be very aware of your client, the client you have installed, the paths you have them installed upon, and this is where you'll start your troubleshooting effort. Obviously, there's not a lot for me to say here other than just be aware of these paths, because we're going to refer to them when when we're telling you to go set something. So let's move on to the next slide. So I've given you how to locate the client workspace, and like I said, this is the important part here. This is where the logs folder is located. When we're asking you to send us up the logs from the client, this is where you're going to find them. When we tell you to set the tracing, we're going to tell you to use a text editor to open the RCP install properties file, which is located in the config subdirectory there, and you're going to add some lines to it. When you're adding the lines to it, make sure that you leave no trailing white space. Trailing white space is probably one of the reasons we have to come back to you most often to ask for the tracing a second time, is because you've either made a typo, or when you've cut and pasted from an email, there's extra characters around it, and sometimes you don't physically see them because they're just empty white space in the text editor, but they're still there. So make sure you leave no trailing white space. And while there is a link here in the middle that talks about the common trace settings in the documentation, keep in mind that sometimes you might have to refer to the specifics of your version. For example, on the next slide here, the Sametime 852 series of clients for audio-video issues had this level of tracing, and this would be the lines we would expect you to set. And it's very important that you follow them, unless you're told specifically otherwise, that you follow them exactly as I would have them laid out here. Finer, finest, and fine all give us a different level of trace information, and if you set one to too much and you set one to too little, then we don't actually get the traces we expect, or we get them in a different order, and sometimes that order is very important to troubleshooting these problems. So again, here's the 852 version of the tracing strings, and in the 9 version, it's a slightly smaller list. But again, so the primary point here is that when you're setting tracing, if we haven't specifically told you what to set for your problem, then it's going to be located in the documentation. At least you could use that as a starting point, and then just be very careful when you're copying and pasting the lines. And obviously, if you're going to hand type the lines, be even more careful. A typo is, well, a typo is a typo, and we don't have a way of knowing what you really meant if you're not very, very careful, obviously. So now, again, once you've set the tracing, so we've located the client workspace, we've modified the RCP install.properties, we've added our tracing to it, we've restarted the client, and we've reproduced the problem. You're going to then grab the logs, and you can view them locally by using, in the Connect client, there's the help, support, view log, and view trace option, and it will allow you to quickly, especially if you kind of know what you're looking for already, it will allow you to view the trace from there in a real-time mode. Most depends upon the problem you're having. If you're a student with this, you may be able to spot the problem very quickly. SIP messages, you're getting a particular error code from a SIP message, or you're getting a particular policy come back. You can use this to visually, during runtime, see what's going on. The other option here, of course, the most common option here on the next slide, is that you'll most likely collect the logs and other data and send it up to us so that we can tell you what we're going to do for you and how we're going to enable and what we're going to get from the diagnostics. In the Notes Embedded client, again, you can click the Help Support, Collect Support Data icon or link in that menu, or in the standalone client, there's a gear icon. You can Help Support, Collect Support Data again. And that will then zip up a lot of information into an archive that you can then upload to the PMR folder. Or if those methods, every now and then those methods will cause like the Notes client to hang for longer than you expect it to, and it might be more intrusive to the end user. If you have access to the machine, of course, you can always just zip the logs folder after you've closed the client. Of course, if you do zip the log folder, which is perfectly fine, just make sure you get all of the information in the logs folder. Don't pick and choose. Don't think we only need the latest file. Don't think, that we don't need, some other piece unless you have a security reason not to send it to us. Send us the entire logs folder. This will allow us to get the complete picture that we may need, and will, of course, prevent us from coming back to you and saying, hey, send me this again. It is important to try to close the client first, and that's because, very specifically, there's files that aren't closed out until the client is closed, and they might not have the last piece of information we need. So close the client, zip the logs, or use the other utilities to zip up the information and send to us. Another thing I probably didn't put on the slides, but it always needs to be said, or just keep in mind that keep accurate notes about what you see and what's going on in the client. Take screenshots so that we can have close to exact timings and be as precise as you can about the problem that the client is having. This goes for everything. Audio video is unique in that we have a lot of moving parts, but when we're talking about the client side of this, the precision and details that the client might be able to provide to you when you're reproducing a problem, all those little details add up to the complete picture. Tracing is great, but sometimes knowing that a user clicked over there or was trying to do this or that, or it took X number of minutes and they got a dialogue, these types of things all come into play and will help us help you much faster. Let's go on to the next slide. So on browser-based clients, I call it a web player affair. There's a plugin that we install in the browser that does this work for us, especially for audio video and for within meetings, application sharing. So if I wanted to share my application here and share something to you in this meeting, there's a little plugin, a little bit of Java code or a little bit of code that has to run on my system in order to grab those screens. These packages are part of, we call it the web player install. Some of the methods for this is moving forward with our new 901 release that we'll talk about toward the end of the presentation. But the thing is that you have to remember that there is a web player that has to be able to both be installed and run on the client system. Probably half of the problems we help you troubleshoot when it comes to browser-based meetings and audio-video not working are based on whether or not this web player is successfully loaded and running at the time. The later Firefox versions had requirements for signing that changed on us, those kinds of things. So keep that in mind as you're going. Also keep in mind that for audio-video specifically within a meeting is that this information about joining the meeting and joining the call and starting the call all comes through the same time proxy piece. So while the client code that does this is a web player plugin, if you don't have awareness in your meeting, like we have here with my little green dot by my name up there, if you don't have that, you're not going to have audio video features either. So keep in mind that we may need to jump around a little bit, and this is where I talk in a moment about right trace in the right place. But keep that in mind, that browser-based stuff, the plugins come from both the meeting server and the proxy server, and they have to be installed and running. So let's go on to the next slide. So in 9.0, we try to do all of these plugin installations automatically. So you join the meeting and your browser is prompted to install the plugin, and we try to do all this stuff behind the scenes. For some customers, this doesn't work out very well because of browser security reasons or a multitude of reasons. There is a standalone install that you can run that you can push to the clients that will also work. The media for this is part of your Media Manager install image, and you can use that. Or from the meeting server front page, there is an install link that you can use when you're into a list of meetings. But all of those, so you can actually install the plugin separately and before you ever join a meeting. Again, a little tease for the 901 servers that have just been released. We actually have changed a little bit about this so that it's going to almost always use the download and install. So keep that in mind that if you're using a 9.0, it's automated. If you're using 9.01, it's going to be a little bit different for you. And again, we'll talk more about that later. Let's go on to the next slide. Once you have the web player, the plugins installed, the location for the logs is going to be in the application data folders, as I've laid out here, or in the user profile, or in a home directory, depending upon your client platform. And this is where you will then go and set your tracing levels and grab the logs. So the logs are located there. If we go to the next slide, we talk about in the web player INI file, which is in those locations, is where you'll set the parameters for how much tracing to get. 0 is the default. We don't really trace much at all at that case, and oftentimes that's why you got to set it then restart the machine. And then we have the different levels. We're always going to tell you to set it to 16 because if you're having trouble, we want to get as much information in one shot as possible. So just go ahead and plan on that, and then if you do that ahead of time, you can obviously send us these logs ahead of time. And just like the client, you just compress the entire logs folder and send that up to us. We rarely need the information outside the logs folder, but if you at least get us that logs folder, then we'll be good to go. And yes. So a couple of common web player issue is if you're having trouble installing it, the automated method through the browser, use the installer. On the meetings homepage, this is the page where you have the list of meetings to attend. There is an install now link. You can click that and you'll download an installer that you can then run separately. Run the installer as the administrator. Even if you have admin rights on the machine, you may need to explicitly run the installer as an administrator to make sure that everything gets installed in the right locations and is successful for you. Next slide. And so that is pretty much the client side. Audio, video, or any of these things, you have a client and a server side. So now we're going to spend the rest of the afternoon or the rest of the morning talking about setting up tracing on the server side, what to send us for analysis, where to start, and as I said, a few AV scenarios that specifically talk about what and where to gather things so that you can kind of help streamline the process here. So, troubleshooting WebSphere-based servers, as I said at the beginning, this information is all located in our info center. We have recommended trace settings. We have a whole list of things about troubleshooting Sametime servers that break it down into different types of servers, different components, and what might be needed for them, and how to set the tracing. So these links are there for your reference, and definitely take advantage of these shortcuts. It'll help you out much quicker. So on the next slide, when you're into the UI of the WebSphere of the system console, in this particular case, I'm really talking about the WebSphere part of it versus the little portion underneath the Sametime side. There is a couple of different ways that you can get to the troubleshooting section. On the left-hand main menu, there is a troubleshooting section, and then you would click like Logs and Trace or Java Dumps and Cores, and then you would pick the server you want to work with, and then that would take you to the next menu. Or from within the servers, there's up at the top left, there's servers and application servers. Then if you pick the server you already know that you want to work with from there, there's also a section that's on the right-hand column that is the same basic thing, the troubleshooting thing here. And again, at the end of the day, both places get you to the same set of steps that we'll talk about next, which is how to set the tracing and what the different tabs mean. So two ways to get to it. All depends upon your familiarity with the system console and with WebSphere itself. And we'll also usually, if we're sending you the information, we'll tell you which way to go. So on the next slide, what I wanted you to see here was that this is for the path where I went down the application servers. I picked my ST Media server, and I clicked the link for Diagnostic Trace Service. And what you'll see here first off, and probably one of the important screens, is that we can alter the number and size of trace files. We can alter where they get written, and we can even alter their names. And usually when we're tracing a system we're going to ask you to increase the maximum file size and the number of historical files. Now I have 50 and 200 here, which is a whole lot of data, but sometimes if a problem doesn't reproduce very quickly, you need those additional files so that we don't lose any data from startup. And of course, if you need to plan that and think about that with the available space on your drive. And also, like I said, you can actually change where those trace logs are written to if you need more room or if you choose to. Most of the time, you don't need to do anything other than increase the number and size of the historical files. There is a configuration and a runtime tab. I'll go into this a little bit more on the next slide when we talk about changing the log detail levels. When you click that link for changing the log detail levels, that takes you to a screen that looks like this. And this is where you're actually going to put in the trace strings that we provide to you or that you got from the info center. The most important thing I can tell you here about this particular slide, and what I want you to understand, is that you see there's two tabs. Now in this case, when I went to this tab, I specifically chose the Runtime tab. And I did that for a reason, because I wanted to change the trace settings without having to restart the server. So if you do things in the Runtime tab, you can do that. I could add a specific trace string, let the service run for 5 or 10 minutes, and capture a problem that's recurring readily, and I don't have to impact my end users. If I save those runtime changes to configuration as well by checking that box up here at the top left, then that means that not only will I get them starting now until the server stops or until I come back in here and change them back, but then on a restart they would also be in play, because there's many times what we need you to do is to get the tracing from startup forward, because we need some specific prints from the startup and configuration of the server that might be lost in later prints. Both of those tabs are valid for both the first screen I showed you and this one, and just keep in mind what they mean differently. A lot of times, a good example of this is if you have a large environment and we need SIP tracing, sometimes the SIP tracing can be so intense that it can cause its own performance problem. So a lot of times we'll ask you to use the Runtime tab so we can get just enough data with hopefully not impacting the overall performance of the system. You can use this tab, you can use this to turn it on, to turn it off, whatever you need to do. Just remember, if you save your changes to config as well, that what impact it might have when you restart the server. Let's go on to the next slide. In the main menu on the left, down under Troubleshooting, there is a link for Java dumps and cores. Occasionally, one of the harder, or occasionally, but on occasion, there are times when what we need to see because of a particular type of problem, especially a server hang or something that's a little more complex, we'll need to actually, or a memory type problem that we're troubleshooting. We may ask you to generate a heap dump or a core or a system dump. And what this page allows you to do is to do that without having to restart the system. So you can come in here, let's say that ST Media Server 2 was hung up and not responding properly. You could come into this menu, check the box next to the server that's in trouble, and generate a heap dump or a Java core, which may give us more information as to what the problem is to help solve the problem. These are a little rarer out for the customers in the field, but they do come in handy. So keep in mind that you can do this, and you can do this multiple times and not have an impact on the server itself from a runtime. It doesn't shut the server down, which is, again, when you're troubleshooting a problem such that these are needed, that's a very important key. A lot of times if you're having that problem and if you restart the server to get the logs, you've cleared out the problem it was having and you got to wait again. So you can do that here. Let's move on to the next slide. So when you're sending, so we've set the trace, we've reproduced the problem, we've got our trace files out in our logs folder. What are you going to send up? Like I mentioned for the client, send the entire profiles log folder. Send everything that's there. There's FFDC folders. If you have multiple application servers on a node or a WebSphere proxy on a node, there'll be logs for that server. There'll be information out in the root about the profile and other processes that may have been run on it. So send the entire logs folder. Don't send just what you think we need. Send everything. And that keeps us from coming back and asking you for an FFDC file. FFDC folder contains extended prints around the first time a problem occurred. These can come in very handy for troubleshooting, so we want to see that entire folder as well. As I mentioned also earlier, be sure to note to the best of your ability. Time the problem was reproduced, the usernames and IP addresses of the users and servers, symptoms or error messages, and a network diagram and details about the environment, because the more complex the environment, the more these details come into play about, which node is running which service, what their IP address is, and, if there's multiple NICs involved, all kinds of little details like that. And sometimes the smallest detail is important, that, oh yeah, we noticed this as well. Those types of things, I was troubleshooting a problem for a large customer last year, and we were kind of round and round trying to figure out what the problem was, and then, just a side comment by somebody on the phone said, oh yeah, when that happened, this other thing happened. I noticed this other thing also happened. And that led us to the solution in a very short order, or at least understanding the problem, because that other little detail led us to it. So no detail is not important, unless we tell you, okay, we know that now. But I think you get the idea here, that sometimes that small details are just as important as the big picture. So that's what we need you to send up. And now, of course, the big question here. Now, this is a big, scary picture. This is a fully realized, high availability or highly available media environment. And as you can see, there's a lot of moving parts. Most of the time, it will depend upon what the issue is as to where you're going to start, but you're always going to start with a client log. Depending upon the error you're getting back from the client, we'll be then asking for logs from the WebSphere SIP proxy if you have one. We'll be likely asking for logs from the proxy registrar, cluster members, and then on around the tree here. Keep in mind, though, that while this is complex, and depending on how many you have of these adds to the number of logs we may ask for, when you're reproducing the problem, try to reproduce it in the simplest environment possible. One of the questions you can ask yourself, of course, is, does the problem only happen if both of my nodes are up, or can I reproduce it with only one of them? If you can reproduce an audio-video problem with only one WAS-SIP proxy and one proxy registrar up and running, then only have that running when you do your reproduction, and then that will simplify your log gathering and your trace settings. And will also help lead us down to where the problem is. For example, if in a two-node environment, if it only happens when the second node is running, that helps us focus the troubleshooting. If it never happens with, again, these are those little details. It only happens when X is running, that's going to lead us down the path here. And so where do you start? From this picture, you kind of have to have those details first, and then you'll walk through. Wireshark can be very important, and I'll use this as a little segue because I don't really talk about Wireshark much in this presentation, but as you're troubleshooting same-time audio-video solutions or problems, Wireshark is your friend, especially if you're using TCP for your SIP transport, because then you can set up a Wireshark on your client. You would capture Wireshark at a WebSphere SIP proxy, potentially at a proxy registrar member, and things like that, and then we can tell the message flow and if or where it might be dropping on the network, which will again lead you to your solution. But just so, again, I think the final point for this particular slide right now is that when you are troubleshooting a complex audio-video environment, just remember there is a lot of connections. If your proxy registrars aren't talking to LDAP, you'll see 401 errors or 403 errors. If your conference managers are not talking to your community clusters, then audio-video may not be enabled at all or may be intermittent. The famous flashing telephone icon is oftentimes because the community servers and the conference managers aren't able to maintain their connection, or because they're not configured consistently. If you're not getting in-way or multi-point audio-video or audio-video in your meeting room, then we're going to know to start down here at your video manager farm and possibly over to your MCU. And I think I cover some of this in the scenario slides. If you're getting to the point where the call is started but you're getting black screens and no data, that usually indicates a problem down here on the bottom part of the path of the UDP traffic, either to another endpoint or to turn, and then on back to MCU. So the first thing as far as where you're going to start is doing your best to understand where the problem is starting to break down, and what your SIP messages are and what your clients are showing you will help you get there. So let's go to the next slide. So the right trace on the right server. So again, these trace settings are in the documentation that I gave you the links to earlier. You'll notice that there's some differences. A proxy registrar, we only need the two hints here, and anytime we're doing SIP analysis to see, that's the SIP is for session initiation protocol. It's how we do our call control. It's the invites, the registers, the updates. Most of the time, that's where we're focused on when calls fail or when calls get dropped unexpectedly. We're going to be looking at the SIP traffic. So on a proxy registrar, we're going to set that, and if we're having trouble on a different server and we need to see SIP traffic, that same string will work for us. The conference focus string is a little more complicated because it does a lot of other work as well. But again, there's the string for you. And if you cut and paste from this presentation, it looks like there's an errant space on that second or on that line there. So be careful to watch for that kind of thing when you're copying and pasting. And the WAS SIP proxy, a common problem we have when people, or a common mistake that's made, is that when you're setting this tracing, is that they'll inadvertently use the proxy registrar trace at the WAS SIP proxy, or the reverse, because they both say SIP in them. Keep in mind exactly what we want on any WAS SIP proxy. If you have a gateway environment and we need to trace SIP, we would use the same type of tracing. If you're using, to make sure you use the right string in the right place. So keep that in mind. Let's move on to the next slide. So on the video manager, we have our primary set of our primary trace string is the com.polycom.proximo.all. That star equals all. The SIP tracing is sometimes needed on the video manager. That's something we'll escalate back and forth with you should that become needed. But most of the time, the tracing we need there is that first string. On the MCU, those are a little more complicated to troubleshoot in real time. Quite honestly, we don't usually need logs from here, except for in some very specific cases. But it does require some very specific steps, TCP dump type steps, and enabling some logs, and that's covered very extensively at that link there. So I'm not going to go into more detail on that here, but there's the link, and it walks you through exactly what to set and exactly how to gather it, some scripts and times to run. On the turn server, the logging.properties file in the turn installation folder is where you will set the tracing levels. Tracing levels are fine, finer, and finest, and usually we'll tell you which we need if we actually need to troubleshoot the turn server. Be very careful to monitor your file sizes and your disk allocation there, because there is no real rollover for those files at this point. I have had a couple of times where, it's run a server out of disk space because they let it running for too long, so keep it in mind. You can actually turn off the trace level entirely once you're satisfied that it's working properly, if that seems to be becoming an issue for you. Keep in mind, probably our biggest troubleshooting steps when it comes to turn is in cases where there's multiple NICs on a turn server, or where you have inbound and outbound routes that need to be taken, where one side of the interface is pointed for the clients and the other and different interfaces used to talk to the MCU. So there's a document out here that talks about various scenarios for the turn server. So keep that in mind as you're laying out your turn server and laying out your deployment, and follow that doc for some specific settings and scenarios on what to do. To the next slide. So we talk about how to set trace and things. Now, things that are going to help us direct the troubleshooting and the questions to ask. Is it a call setup problem? This is an error before the call is established. You've clicked a user and you've said start call, and you get a SIP error message back, or the other user never gets that prompt to start the call. That's one side of the equation. That's usually in the SIP side. Is it a media problem? Blank screen, no audio, those types of things. Most often that's either UDP is not available on the network, turn server is not available, or quite honestly, sometimes it's because the user had their mic muted. You'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, but I'm often surprised that sometimes we forget to ask the most basic question for certain types of problems, so keep that in mind. Never be afraid to double check that the end user that's reporting the problem has got their hardware set up correctly, their local laptop, that they haven't muted the mic, or that they've actually got a camera plugged in. It happens. If it's a clustered environment, like I said earlier, does it happen only when a specific node is running? Can it be reproduced with only one of each running? And again, that helps us to both limit the amount of logs we have to review and you have to provide, but it also helps us understand if it only happens with a specific node, then we can review the configuration for that node. We can really dive into something like that a little quicker than if we're not sure of that information. If the client's getting an error message, what error message is it? Take a screenshot of it. Get as much detail as you can. And have you validated both your, again, we talked about the client config a moment ago. Does it have a microphone? Is it muted? But did you validate your WebSphere configuration? I think everyone on the call that's gone through an AV deployment understands that there's a number of manual steps that have to be taken while you're deploying while you're deploying audio video, and that as you move into high availability environments, there's even more manual steps. It only takes a single typo or a config that's been copied and pasted from one server to another that's not valid to cause a little hiccup in the system. So validate your config steps, because that's one of the things we're going to do right off the bat most of the time, is ask for the config and walk through it and make sure that things are set up the way we expect it to. And again, it only takes one typo. An invalid host name in the wrong location can cause all kinds of problems. Let's move on to the next slide. So some scenarios. No AV icons in the rich client. Outside of policy restrictions, where you've said in policy that the user or users isn't able to do the service, it's usually caused by a couple of things. Whether or not the community servers, or the conference focus servers and the community servers can talk to each other. The conference focus server, and sometimes we call it the conference manager, is the server that tells community that audio video is available, just from a system standpoint. If the conference focus isn't talking to all of your community servers, then the community servers it's not talking to would not have AV services for those end users. So check your trusted IPs, check your network, make sure that the conference focus can talk to all the servers it's supposed to. Client connectivity to the proxy registrar is your next most obvious problem. We would usually ask for client and SIP traces at that point, and we're usually looking at straight connectivity to the host name that is specified for the proxy registrar from that client on the port that's specified in stavconfig.xml. And if it's not connectivity, it's usually authorization. If you're doing TLS, that means that we are doing LTPA authentication for those clients as they're registering, and if the LTPA is not configured properly or single sign-on isn't configured properly, then they will not get their icons, and there will be appropriate SIP messages on the client and server logs. I've got a note here about video manager health check failures. early in 9.0 releases, if the video manager was configured for the environment but not available, then we disabled audio-video even for one-on-one calls. So if you're using earlier builds of Sametime 9.0, get updated. The video manager, we actually solved that problem later in a later release. It really wasn't a problem. It was by design. We decided early on that, once you've configured in-way, if in-way wasn't available, then, we disabled audio-video entirely. After listening to our customers, we made a change to make that no longer happen. And then, of course, conference focus must be able to register the proxy registrar. So, again, the conference focus is a key point to look at here if you're not getting your icons. If you still haven't spotted the problem, then you're going to gather client, proxy registrar, and conference focus logs for analysis. That will tell us what's going on, and we'll be able to help you solve the problem. So, no AV in browser-based or mobile clients. One of the main things that happens is the loss of either the plugin or awareness. So the very first thing I'm going to check for a meetings audio-video problem is to make sure that the Sametime meeting server is configured to use a Sametime proxy. You have to have awareness enabled. The awareness functions is our glue to community, and community is our glue then therefore into the audio-video environment because it's a community that surfaces that information to the client. So, do you have awareness in the browser? If you don't, solve that problem first. If you do, then similar to the previous slide, the community that the Sametime proxy is connecting to must be aware that AV is available. Make sure the conference focus is talking to that community server as well. The client must be able to reach the proxy registrar. If it's an external client only that's having this problem, is the SIP Edge proxy involved? Remember, again, you've got network paths to consider, so look at where your browser is connecting as opposed to where your rich client might be connecting from. One of the first troubleshooting steps I'll often do is try to do both my browser tests and my rich client tests on the same physical machine, because if one works, then at least I know that from a network perspective the other should work, and I can then troubleshoot from there. Of course, the next question to ask is that plugin loaded? If it is, then enable the Web AV debug for analysis. For mobile clients, all the above still applies, but we'll have to enable tracing and send in for analysis because the interaction behind the scenes is a little more complex than at a rich client or at a browser-based level. But Sametime proxy connectivity is key. Connecting to the proxy registrar is key, and those types of things make all the difference in the world. The next slide, please.
Tony, can you just check your mic? It sounds like I don't know if it hit something or it moved, but we can hear you.
Is that better?
It still sounds odd. I can hear you, though.
Okay. Might be my headset. Let me switch to my handheld. Hang on.
Is that better?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. Well, so that's Troubleshooting 101. Sometimes you have to switch your microphone. Anyway, so if a call fails to start, the analysis will depend upon a couple of things. Is it stuck in connecting? Then if so, we'll need to gather client and server SIP traces. If it's connected but no audio-video streams, can the client connect to the other client? In a one-on-one call, without turn involved, the UDP streams go from client A to client B directly. If turn is involved, then, or if NAT's involved and we need turn, those are decisions we'll have to make as you're planning out your environment, but then we'll also need to gather traces and make sure that the clients can connect to the different endpoints appropriately. Client traces and Wiresharks are usually the best ways to go here. And probably, I always should add just and server logs, but that's where we're going to start. That's where we're going to start with these. Let's go to the next slide. So if you can't add a third person to a one-on-one session, the first question to ask is if the video manager itself is available. Is the MCU available? Can the clients the client connectivity in this particular case is not to the video manager, but to the MCU, and a lot of times what we'll need is a Wireshark to see if streams were available over there, or more correctly, we will also need logs from the conference focus and the video manager in order to see why that escalation did not work. So, meeting room AV issues. Questions to ask is the problem on the moderator or the participant side? What error message is received by the client? If the moderator can start the call but a user can't join the call, do they get the join button? Those types of questions are what's going to tell us what's going on. And if it's a browser, as I said earlier, make sure that they are getting awareness. If they're getting an error message, what error message is received? One of the more common problems is the notification server host settings in STAV config XML. This is how the video manager notifies the conference manager that a particular call is started and ready for that third person. So if those aren't set correctly, those can cause problems, and there's a tech note on that. If it's a continuous presence issue, which means that you're not getting multiple speakers, but you're only getting follow the active speaker mode, this could be caused by a handle domain setting in your configuration, or it could be because of bandwidth issues. Those are a little more difficult to tell right off the bat, but one of the first things we'll do is we'll check the handle domains. Again, for analysis, you would gather the client, the proxy registrar, conference focus, and video manager logs in this particular case. So this is a reference document here, and it's really just to kind of show that we have a number of SIP response codes that we're paying attention to. On the left, 100, 180s, and 200s are all call negotiations. So a 100 trying 180s and 200 OKs are expected. We want nothing but 200 OKs if everything is working properly. 401s and 403s are usually authentication and authorization type issues, and I'm going to be looking at your single sign-on configuration or access to LDAP and things of that nature. 404s are not founds. Those are usually users, and what can happen there is if a user's registration happens to expire or if they're no longer registered, and you try to make that call in just the right window. It can happen for conferences, but much less often. The ones we see the most often in environments is the 408s and the 430s, the timeouts and the flow control failed. Those are almost always indicative of a network type issue. We've lost connectivity during a call or as during call setup to the endpoint that we're trying to send the message to. Most often it's going to be connectivity to the end users. Much less often is it to the servers, but if you have load balancers and other things there, then obviously those can also come into play with losing our connectivity. 481 call does not exist. Those are much rarer. Those usually you'll see in the logs on a buy condition where users have hung up, but the buy messages are a couple of seconds later. Those are not usually a big deal. Sometimes they are. 483, too many hops. We'll see this more often in a deployment between SIP Edge and our proxy registrar, and it always points to a misconfiguration of some of the routes and the host names within them, and usually indicates that the servers are bouncing the messages back and forth instead of handling them. Usually can be solved just with config changes. 500 server internal errors. Those are the ones we really want to watch for, and we'll always want server logs if you're seeing them in order to track down exactly what caused them. And finally, 503 service unavailable. If you're at load balancers, that's when I'm going to be looking at the network for load balancers routing traffic correctly to the back end, or if they've detected that servers are down when they shouldn't. And let's move on to the next slide. SIP message types. These are the types of messages you'll see if you're walking through the SIP logging or a Wireshark trace. Registers are the first thing that users will do in order to register for service so that other people can call them and so that they can call other users. If you can't register, you'll never be able to make calls, so those have to be able to happen. Invites are exactly what they sound. They're used to invite users to specific calls, and that's the first step in a call. You'll see an invite, then you'll see an OK, you'll see a ringing, you'll see the different messages as we walked through before. Subscribes and updates are for sending messages and for subscribing for information on specific calls. They have to work as well. And then finally, bye, which is the message that you'll use when you're hanging up a call. So those are the types we're usually looking for through the logs as we're analyzing what's going on with specific calls. And then, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I would usually recap what I copied through on the earlier slide for this. But Media Manager, especially in a highly available environment, is complex. There's a lot of moving parts. I'm hoping that this session has walked you through where you would set tracing, where to find the right tracing settings to set, and how to gather some data in the environment should we need to troubleshoot a problem. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. And as we're opening it up for questions, I will state that we are having another open mic toward the end of this month. I believe it's the 24th on the Sametime 9.0.1 release that just went out yesterday. That is an update for the all of the components, which includes a lot of fixes and new features. And we will go over that in great detail on the 24th. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philip.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question, you may press star followed by the number 1. Please unmute your phone and record your name clearly when prompted. Your name is required to introduce your question. To withdraw your request, you may press star followed by the number 2. One moment, please, as we wait for the first question.
Thank you. And just a note for those in the meeting room, I am going to be posting poll questions. Just give us an idea of how the session went for you and lets us know how we're doing. So we do appreciate your feedback on those poll questions that you'll see.
At this time, speakers, we don't have any questions on queue, but once again, that is star 1 to ask a question.
All right, thank you, Philip. We'll see if we get anything queued up. I'll also give time, Tony, if there's anything that you want to go back over or anything that you want to touch on.
You know, I can't think of anything at this particular moment.
Not to put you on the spot or anything, but sorry. I hate dead air, can you tell?
Yeah. Well, what I would want to do is I'd like for everybody that's on the call to submit your email addresses, because if you've got no questions now, we'll expect good data from you when you turn in your PMRs.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. There will be a test on the 24th, so.
It's actually the 25th, so I think that's Wednesday. Yeah, it's going to be on May 25th. I posted a link into the chat for the webcast document for that one, so if folks want to put it on their calendar.
Ben Williams says he has a question which he is logged on the phone.
Yes, sir. Our first question comes from the line of Ben Williams. Sir, your line is now open.
Tony, hi. Hi there.
Hi, Ben.
Quick one. The turn server, again, this is more troubleshooting, your thing here, but I was just wanted to ask, turn server, I know it can listen on UDP and TCP. Can it effectively, can clients try to connect via UDP? If that fails because, say, they're behind a corporate firewall, doesn't allow that out, then fail over to use TCP? I know TCP is not preferable, but is that kind of a solution that can work with web and thick clients and the turn server?
Yes. In fact, the clients are configured or programmed. That's not the right word. Configured is not the right word. When you configure turn in STAV config for both TCP and UDP, the client will prefer UDP if it's available, and then will fall back to TCP if it's not.
Good, because I hadn't got. Sorry.
So that's out of the box the way it's going to work without having to do any extra work.
Oh, that's good. Okay, I just need to, because I'd always done TCP just because of the more chance that those ports be open. But I shall play around with that then. Thanks very much, Tony.
Okay.
Cheers.